Hello and welcome to Pirate Slug Stories, the place where forgotten pirate legends rise from the deep. In today's tale, we will be diving into the mystery of a needle that doesn't seek the north, but instead hunts for the pieces of a soul left behind. We will follow a journey to a place where the wind speaks in voices you used to know, and a treasure that offers the one thing more dangerous than death, the truth of who you were before the sea claimed you. But be warned, for some memories are buried for a reason, and retrieving them comes with a price that no amount of gold can pay. For many years during the era of the Great Silence, when the charts of the known world ended abruptly at the edge of the Sapphire Reach, there was a legend about the Isle of Echoes. It was said that this island didn't exist in any one place, but drifted through the mist, appearing only to those who had lost something they could never replace. The legend claimed that every forgotten memory, every lost love, and every betrayed promise ever whispered into the ocean washed ashore on the Isle of Echoes, crystallizing into shimmering shards of iridescent glass. To hold a shard was to relive a moment of your life with a clarity that was almost agonizing. Captain Elian had a spiritual connection to this legend, as his own father had spent 3 decades obsessed with the myth, filling dozens of journals with frantic sketches of a coast made of crystal. Elian had grown up in the shadow of that obsession, watching his father fade away, not from age, but from the slow erosion of his own mind, as if the Isle of Echoes was calling back the memories his father had spent a lifetime chasing. Elian had spent years pretending he didn't believe the stories, but he had inherited one thing from his father's estate that proved the legend was real: the memory compass. It was a heavy, tarnished brass instrument, but instead of a magnetic needle, it held a sliver of polished obsidian that floated in a pool of silver oil. The needle never pointed north. It didn't point to any landmass known to the Admiralty. Instead, it trembled and spun wildly whenever Elian thought of the gaps in his own life, the blurred faces of his childhood, the missing months of his youth, the strange, hollow feeling in his chest that felt like a door locked from the other side. Elian commanded the Siren's Wake, a lean, fast schooner built from dark ironwood and rigged with sails the color of a bruised sky. His crew was a collection of the displaced and the desperate, men and women who, like him, felt they were missing a piece of themselves. They didn't sail for gold or spice. They sailed because Elian promised them that the Siren's Wake would find the one thing the world had stolen from them. The voyage had been grueling, pushing them through waters where the sea turned a thick, oily black and the stars above shifted into constellations that belonged to a different sky. For weeks, the obsidian needle of the compass had been erratic, spinning in dizzying circles. But as they crossed the threshold of the Sapphire Reach, the needle suddenly snapped into place. It stopped trembling. It pointed with a violent, unwavering precision toward a wall of fog that looked less like weather and more like a curtain of gray silk. As the Siren's Wake pierced the fog, the atmosphere changed instantly. The crashing of the waves grew muffled, as if the ocean had turned to velvet. The air became unnaturally warm, smelling of old parchment and dried jasmine. Then, the lookout let out a cry that sounded more like a gasp of terror than a warning. Emerging from the mist was a shoreline that defied every law of nature. The beach was not made of sand, but of millions of tiny, translucent crystals that hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. Giant spires of glass rose from the earth like frozen lightning, reflecting colors that didn't exist in any rainbow. As the ship drifted closer to the shore, the crew fell silent. They weren't just seeing the island, they were hearing it. The wind didn't howl here. It whispered. It whispered in the voices of dead mothers, lost brothers, and old friends. It whispered secrets that the sailors had forgotten they ever knew. Elian stood at the railing, his hand gripping the memory compass. The obsidian needle was now vibrating so hard it threatened to shatter the glass casing. But as Elian looked toward the center of the island, where the tallest crystal spire pierced the gray sky, he noticed something that chilled his blood. Floating just offshore were the bleached ribs of a dozen ships, all of them identical in design to the Siren's wake. They weren't shipwrecks from different eras. They looked like echoes of his own ship, frozen in different states of decay. The first sign of true danger came not from the island, but from the compass itself. As Elian stared at the reflections in the crystal shore, the silver oil inside the compass began to turn a deep, bruised purple. The needle didn't just point toward the spire anymore. It began to pull. Elian felt a physical tug in his chest, a sudden, violent longing that nearly pulled him over the railing. He realized then that the Isle of Echoes didn't just store memories. It hunted the people who wanted them back. And as the Siren's wake touched the crystalline sand with a soft, melodic chime, Elian saw a figure standing on the beach, waiting for them. The figure was draped in a coat of shimmering glass, and though its face was a blur of shifting reflections, it held something in its hand that made Elian's heart stop. It was a logbook bound in the exact same leather as the one Elian had carried since he was a boy. But this one was dripping with fresh, salty seawater, as if it had just been pulled from the depths of a grave. The hunt for the missing pieces of his life had begun. But as the whispers of the island grew into a roar, Elian wondered if some parts of the soul were meant to stay lost. The shifting mists did not just obscure the horizon, they swallowed it. For days, the crew of the Gilded Wake sailed through a world of oppressive, milky white, where the sound of the waves became a muffled heartbeat, and the wind whispered in voices that sounded far too much like people they had left behind. Elian stood at the helm, his knuckles white against the worn wood, staring at the brass instrument in his palm. It was a compass, but not one that cared for the North Star. Its needle didn't quiver, it pulsed. The needle didn't track magnetic poles, it tracked the weight of the heart. Whenever Elian thought of the life he had forgotten, the needle would spin violently, then lock onto a direction with a sharp, metallic click. To navigate the mists, the compass demanded a price. It didn't want a destination, it wanted a regret. "Captain, the men are unsettled," called out Kale, the first mate, his voice strained. Kale was a man of iron and salt, but even he looked pale in the unnatural light of the mists. "The fog is playing tricks. Half the crew swears they can see their childhood homes floating on the water. The others say they hear the bells of sunken cities. We're sailing in circles, Elian." Elian looked at the needle. It was pointing dead ahead, vibrating with an intensity that felt like a warning. "We aren't in circles, Kale. We're descending. The compass isn't leading us to a place on a map. It's leading us to the things we tried to bury." As they pushed deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The water beneath the hull turned from a deep navy to a translucent, ghostly silver. Beneath the surface, massive shapes drifted, not whales or fish, but the silhouettes of ships that had vanished centuries ago, their masts like skeletal fingers reaching for a sun they would never see again. The crew fell silent, the only sound being the rhythmic creak of the rigging and the heavy, wet slap of the mist against the deck. Suddenly, the compass needle snapped 90 degrees to the right. Elian jerked the wheel, bringing the Gilded Wake into a sharp turn. As they pivoted, the mists parted for a fleeting second, revealing a jagged spire of black rock rising from the sea like a broken tooth. Perched atop the spire was a lighthouse, but its lantern didn't cast a beam of light. Instead, it emitted a pulsing wave of darkness that rippled across the water, turning the silver sea into a void. "Look there," shouted the lookout from the crow's nest. "Something's floating in the wake." Elian leaned over the railing. Bobbing in the water was a series of floating lanterns, hundreds of them, each encased in salt-crusted glass. As the ship passed them, the lanterns flared. Inside, each one wasn't a flame, but a vivid, flickering image. Elian saw a flash of a woman's laugh, a gold coin slipping through a child's fingers, a betrayal whispered in a dark alley. These were memories, discarded, stolen, or forgotten fragments of 1,000 different lives, drifting in the current like luminous driftwood. The crew grew frenzied. Men leaped toward the railing, desperate to catch a lantern that might hold a piece of their own lost past. A sailor screamed in joy as he grabbed a glowing orb, only to recoil in horror as the image inside shifted from a loving embrace to a scene of absolute ruin. The lanterns weren't gifts, they were lures. "Get back from the edge!" Elian roared, but his voice was nearly drowned out by a sudden guttural moan that seemed to rise from the very depths of the ocean. The sea began to churn. The silver water boiled, and from the void beneath the ship, a massive, rusted chain erupted, slamming onto the deck with a force that nearly capsized the vessel. The chain was thick as a man's torso, covered in black barnacles and dripping with a slime that smelled of ancient graves. It didn't just hit the deck, it anchored itself, dragging the gilded wake toward the black spire and the lighthouse of darkness. Elian looked down at his compass. The needle was no longer pulsing. It was spinning in a frantic, endless circle, as if the object it was searching for was no longer in front of them, but directly beneath them. The mists closed back in, tighter than before, cutting off the horizon and leaving the crew trapped in a claustrophobic world of white fog and black iron. As the ship was pulled closer to the jagged rocks, Elian realized the truth of the shifting mists. This wasn't a stretch of ocean to be crossed. It was a graveyard of the mind, and they had just handed the gatekeeper the key. The compass hadn't been guiding them to their memories. It had been using their regrets to scent them, leading them straight into the grip of something that fed on the things people wanted to forget. The gilded wake groaned, the wood splintering as the chain tightened, pulling them toward the shadow of the spire. Elian gripped the logbook in his coat, feeling the leather pulse against his chest. The descent was over. They had arrived, and the price of admission was about to be collected. The gilded wake didn't just anchor, it shuddered, the hull scraping against a beach of crushed white quartz that shimmered like powdered bone under a bruised violet sky. As Elian stepped onto the shore of the Isle of Echoes, the air didn't smell of salt and rot, but of things long gone. Baked bread from a childhood kitchen, the scent of rain on a dusty road, the perfume of a lover lost to a storm a decade ago. It was a sweetness that felt like a trap. The crew followed him in a daze, their boots crunching on the quartz. They didn't speak, they couldn't. The silence of the island was heavy, pressing against their ears like deep water. As they marched toward the black spire that pierced the horizon, the environment began to shift. The jungle didn't just grow, it breathed. The vines were not green, but a pale, translucent silver, and they didn't cling to the trees. They reached for the sailors, brushing against their shoulders with a familiarity that was terrifying. It happened first to Kale, the navigator. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes glazing over. He dropped his charts, the ink-stained parchment fluttering into the white sand. Elian turned to shout at him, but the words died in his throat. Kale wasn't looking at the spire anymore. He was looking at a shimmering distortion in the air, a ripple like heat rising from a summer road. Within that ripple, a woman appeared. She wasn't a ghost, not exactly. She was a memory made flesh, vibrant and warm, calling to him in a voice that sounded like a song he had forgotten he knew. Kale didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the ripple, his expression one of absolute vacant peace. He didn't see the silver vines winding around his ankles, anchoring him to the quartz beach. He didn't notice that as he stepped closer to the memory, the color began to drain from his own skin, his eyes turning the same milky white as the sand beneath his feet. "Kale, get back!" Elian lunged forward, grabbing the navigator by the collar of his coat and wrenching him away. The ripple snapped shut with a sound like a closing book. Kale collapsed, gasping, his eyes returning to normal, but he looked shaken, confused. He looked at his hands as if he didn't recognize them. I remembered," Kale whispered, his voice trembling. "I remembered the day I left home. I could feel the warmth of the sun. I could smell the clover. Elian, why are we here? Who are you?" Cold dread coiled in Elian's gut. The island wasn't just a place of echoes, it was a predator. It didn't attack with claws or cannons, it attacked with the heart. It was peeling away their present identities, replacing the grit and hardship of their current lives with the idealized ghosts of their pasts. It was offering them a paradise of memory in exchange for the reality of their existence. The rest of the crew was succumbing. One by one, they drifted away from the path, lured by whispers only they could hear. The lookout began to weep, claiming he could see his father standing among the silver trees. The cook stopped walking entirely, staring at a patch of empty air with a smile of pure, mindless contentment. They weren't fighting the island. They were surrendering to it, lured by the promise that the pain of the present could be erased by the beauty of what once was. Elian gripped the leather logbook against his chest, the only thing that felt solid in a world that was becoming a dream. He realized the danger wasn't the spire or the shadows. It was the longing. The island fed on the holes in their souls, filling them with shimmering lies until there was nothing left of the person who had sailed here. As he struggled to pull his crew back together, a sound echoed from the direction of the spire, a low, resonant chime that vibrated through the very marrow of his bones. With the sound came a shift in the wind. The sweetness of the air vanished, replaced by a sudden, freezing chill. From the silver jungle emerged a figure. It wasn't a monster, but a reflection. It wore Elian's own coat, carried a mirrored version of his logbook, and moved with a grace that Elian had never possessed. The figure had no face, only a swirling vortex of reflections, like a mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The reflection didn't speak, but Elian heard the voice inside his head, a perfect imitation of his own. Why fight for a life of salt and scars? The reflection whispered. When you can stay in the moment you were truly happy. Give me the book, Elian. Give me the anchor to your grief, and you can forget the storm. You can forget the loss. You can simply be. Elian looked back at his crew, who were now little more than hollow shells, their eyes wide and vacant, drifting toward the silver vines. He looked at the faceless thing that promised him peace. The mystery of the Isle of Echoes was finally clear. The island didn't store memories, it harvested them, and the entity before him was the harvester, waiting for the moment the weight of the past became too heavy to carry. He stepped back, his boots sliding on the quartz, and drew his blade, though he knew steel could not cut a reflection. The gilded wake was a distant silhouette on the shore, and the path to the spire was now flanked by the ghosts of everyone he had ever loved, all of them reaching out, all of them begging him to stop fighting and just come home. The reflections of the ghosts began to merge, their translucent forms swirling into a single, shimmering pillar of light at the heart of the spire. As the light settled, a figure emerged. She was small, barely reaching Elian's waist, wearing a salt-stained dress that fluttered in a wind that didn't exist. She held a small, carved wooden bird in her hands, the very toy Elian had carved for his daughter a lifetime ago, before the great storm had claimed her and the sea had stolen his mind. The memory was so vivid it felt physical. He could smell the scent of jasmine and sea salt that always clung to her hair. He could see the way she tilted her head when she laughed. For a moment, the cold, oppressive weight of the spire vanished, replaced by a warmth he had forgotten existed. This was what the compass had promised. This was why he had sailed through nightmares and defied the laws of the ocean. The memory of his daughter wasn't just a recollection. It was her essence, preserved in the crystal heart of the spire, waiting to be reclaimed. But as Elian reached out, his fingers trembling, the harvester spoke. It didn't use a voice, but a vibration that echoed in the marrow of his bones. The entity revealed the hidden cost of the spire's magic. The balance of the sea required a trade, to bring a lost memory back into the living world, to make it real and permanent once more. A current bond of equal strength had to be severed. Elian looked back toward the shore. Through the haze of the spire's influence, he could see the gilded wake. He saw the silhouettes of his crew, the men and women who had bled for him, who had stood by him when he was a broken man with a hole in his soul. He thought of Kale, the navigator who had risked his life to steer them through the mirror seas. He thought of Mara, who had shared her last rations with him during the doldrums, and had become the sister he never had. These people weren't just sailors. They were the family he had built from the wreckage of his former life. The Harvester's offer was absolute. If Elian claimed the memory of his daughter, the bond he shared with his crew would vanish. Not only would they forget him, but the loyalty and love that bound them together would be erased, leaving them strangers to one another, drifting ships in a cold, indifferent ocean. He would have his daughter's ghost back in his heart, but he would be utterly alone in the world, leading a crew of ghosts who no longer knew why they followed him. Elian stared at the small girl. She smiled, a fragile, flickering thing, and held out the wooden bird. The longing in his chest was a physical pain, a screaming void that had defined every waking second of his existence. To say no was to kill her a second time. To say yes was to betray the only people who had ever truly seen him for who he was. He looked at the wooden bird, then at the distant, flickering lights of the gilded wake. He remembered the night in the cove when Kale had told him that a captain is only as strong as the trust of his crew. He remembered Mara's laugh after a narrow escape from the Navy. He realized that while the memory of his daughter was a beautiful anchor, it was an anchor that kept him drowned in the past. His crew, however, were the wind in his sails. They were the living, breathing proof that he could be loved even after everything had been taken from him. His hand stopped inches from the girl's face. The warmth of the memory felt like a lure, a sweet poison designed to keep him trapped in the spire forever. The Harvester shifted, its form undulating with anticipation, sensing the conflict. It knew the power of grief. It had fed on it for centuries. Elian's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible over the humming of the crystal. "I cannot build a future on the ruins of a ghost," he murmured. With a sudden, sharp motion, Elian didn't grab the memory. Instead, he took the leather logbook from his coat and slammed it shut. As the cover clicked, he turned his back on the shimmering figure of his daughter. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He felt the phantom sensation of a small hand brushing against his sleeve, a final, silent goodbye that felt less like a loss and more like a release. The moment the choice was made, the spire reacted. The pillar of light shattered into 1,000 shards of frozen salt. The ghosts of the past vanished in a sudden, violent gust of wind that nearly knocked him off his feet. The Harvester let out a sound like grinding tectonic plates, a shriek of frustration that echoed through the quartz halls. The entity had been denied its feast. The ground beneath Elian began to tremble. The spire, no longer anchored by the weight of his longing, began to collapse. The crystal walls cracked, raining down splinters of light. Elian sprinted back toward the shore, the world dissolving into chaos around him. He ran not toward a treasure, but toward the people who were waiting for him on the deck of the gilded wake, their lanterns cutting through the dark, calling his name into the storm. The spire of reflections shrieked as it tore itself apart, the sound like 1,000 mirrors breaking at once. Elian felt the shockwave throw him backward, the salt-white sand of the beach rushing up to meet him. As he gasped for air, he looked down at his hand. He was still clutching the brass compass, and it was vibrating with a violent, erratic energy. The needle was no longer pointing toward the spire. It was spinning in a frantic circle, trying to pull the fragmented memories of his crew back into the void. From the deck of the gilded wake, he could see his crew. They were frozen, their eyes vacant, their bodies swaying like reeds in a wind only they could feel. They weren't just waiting for him, they were being drained. The entity of the spire had failed to claim Elian's soul, so it had turned its hunger toward the only things left, the minds of the men and women who had followed him into the mist. Elian looked at the logbook in his other hand, the leather warm and pulsing. He realized then that the compass was not a tool for finding what was lost, but a tether. It had created a bridge between the living and the dead, and as long as the compass existed, the island would never let them go. The treasure of recovered memories was a lure, a beautiful lie designed to keep sailors anchored to their grief until they became part of the quartz landscape. He thought of the faces of his crew, Kale, the navigator who had taught him how to read the stars. Mara, the cook who kept them fed with stolen spices and laughter, and the others who had become his only true family. He had spent years chasing the ghosts of his parents, obsessed with a past that could never be rewritten. He had almost sacrificed the living for the sake of the dead. The gilded wake groaned, her hull beginning to crystallize, the wood turning into the same cold, translucent quartz as the spire. The island was claiming the ship. Elian stood up, his boots sinking into the shimmering sand. He looked at the compass one last time. The needle suddenly stopped. It pointed straight at his heart, whispering a final, seductive promise. Stay. Give us the crew and you can have every moment back. Every laugh, every word, every embrace. You can be a son again. Elian's grip tightened. Tears blurred his vision, but his voice was steady. The dead don't sail ships, he whispered, and the living don't belong to the mist. With a roar of defiance, Elian slammed the brass compass down onto a jagged shard of fallen quartz. He didn't just drop it, he brought his heel down on the glass face with every ounce of strength in his body. The sound was deafening. A blinding flash of gold and violet light erupted from the point of impact, rippling outward in a massive wave. The tether snapped. Across the beach, the crew of the Gilded Wake suddenly gasped in unison, their eyes snapping back to clarity. The vacant stares vanished, replaced by confusion, then recognition, then a surge of adrenaline. On the ship, the crystallization reversed in an instant, the quartz melting back into weathered oak and salt-stained hemp. The spire gave one final, guttural moan and vanished, collapsing into a singularity of light that sucked the remaining ghosts and reflections back into the depths of the earth. The island didn't just break, it began to dissolve. The shoreline retreated, the jungle faded into a gray haze, and the very air seemed to exhale a century of held breath. "Captain," Kale's voice roared from the deck, sharp and alive. "Get your boots moving, Elian. The tide is turning and the land is leaving us." Elian didn't look back. He sprinted through the dissolving sand, leaping across the narrowing gap between the shore and the ship. As his boots hit the deck of the Gilded Wake, the last piece of the island, a single floating spire of quartz, sank silently beneath the waves. The mist parted. For the first time in weeks, the horizon opened up, revealing a deep sapphire ocean and a sun that felt warm on their skin. The oppressive weight that had hung over the crew was gone. They were lighter, not because they had found their lost memories, but because they had finally stopped searching for them. Elian walked to the railing and looked down at the empty space where the island had been. In his hand, he still held the logbook. He opened it to the final page, where the ink was still wet. He took a charcoal pencil and wrote a single line. "Some things are not lost, they are simply gone, and there is a different kind of peace in letting them stay that way." He didn't throw the book overboard. He kept it as a reminder that the greatest treasure a pirate can possess is not gold nor memories, but the courage to sail toward a tomorrow that isn't haunted by yesterday. As the Gilded Wake caught the wind, its sails snapping tight against a clear sky, the crew gathered around their captain. They didn't talk about the spire, and they didn't ask about the things they had forgotten. They simply laughed, shared a bottle of rum, and charted a course for a port they had never visited. The ocean behind them remained flat and silent, a mirror reflecting nothing but the endless blue. No map would ever find that island again, for the island only existed for those who were too broken to leave. And whenever the wind howls in a certain key or the sea turns a ghostly shade of teal, old sailors still tell the tale of the captain who broke the world's most beautiful compass just to save his friends. They say that if you listen closely to the waves, you can still hear the faint sound of shattering glass, reminding every soul on the water that the only way to truly move forward is to leave the ghosts behind.